His voice sliced through the room like a cold blade. "Perhaps," Justice Clarence Thomas murmured, "the Congresswoman would benefit from revisiting the basics of constitutional law." A soft chuckle rippled among his peers, measured, practiced, patronizing. The faint hum of the courtroom lights became thunder in the silence that followed. Every camera locked onto Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. Her hands rested still, her gaze unwavering, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to suggest she'd seen this act before. Behind that calm stare burned something sharper than anger, certainty, the kind born not from privilege, but from surviving spaces that tried to erase her brilliance. For a heartbeat, Thomas looked triumphant, mistaking her silence for submission. But Crockett wasn't silent. She was timing the moment. The nation watched through glowing screens as tension coiled tighter. Her expression didn't just speak, it declared, "You're underestimating the wrong woman." The murmurs faded. Even the judge's pen hovered midair, uncertain. Crockett drew a breath, eyes locked on the man who had mocked her. And then, no one in that chamber, or across the millions watching online, expected the words that would follow to turn the entire courtroom upside down. Just hours earlier, the chamber had felt like any other hearing. Polished wood, murmured formality, and the faint, practiced rhythm of political theater. The session was meant to probe judicial accountability, a procedural discussion about ethics, disclosures, and precedent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come for procedure. She came with purpose. Her questions cut deeper than protocol. They reached for truth. Shouldn't the highest court, she asked evenly, be held to the highest standard? Her tone was respectful but unyielding, each word landing like a quiet challenge to power itself. Across the bench, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned back, the faintest smirk curving his lips. His fingers drummed against the wood. Deliberate and dismissive, the air thickened. It wasn't the first time a woman like her, a black woman, unapologetically sharp, had been met with that expression. It was the look of entitlement disguised as patience. He interrupted mid-sentence, voice heavy with the certainty of a man accustomed to having the last word. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, your interpretation betrays a lack of foundational understanding." The words lingered like a stain on the air. Crockett paused, not because she was uncertain, but because the gravity of the moment demanded precision. Around them, aides shifted uncomfortably. The committee chair glanced toward the cameras, sensing what was coming. What looked like a routine hearing was about to become a viral reckoning. This wasn't just a clash of legal minds. It was a collision between two versions of America, one clinging to the old order, the other demanding that intellect, not lineage, define authority. The stakes weren't confined to that room. They pulsed through every living room, every classroom, every young woman who had ever been told she didn't belong in spaces of power. Thomas chuckled softly, almost to himself, as though the weight of his robe could smother the spark rising across the aisle. The smirk was his final mistake, because when he laughed, Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer. She redefined the conversation. For decades, Clarence Thomas had sat at the summit of American power, robed, reserved, and largely untouchable. His silence on the bench had become legend. His few words weighed like verdicts from Olympus. To many, he was the embodiment of permanence, a man insulated by time, rank, and ritual. But behind the aura of dignity lay something colder, detachment. Thomas had perfected the art of distance. When critics questioned his judgments, he called them partisan. When journalists probed his financial ties or ethics disclosures, he waved it off as noise from the media class. Over the years, this posture hardened into arrogance, not the loud, brash kind, but the quieter kind that grows in men who begin to believe they are above reproach. He had faced senators who trembled at his gaze, presidents who courted his approval, protesters who shouted his name in the streets, their voices dissolving into the marble silence of the court. And through it all, Thomas never flinched. He would simply adjust his glasses, that small, practiced gesture, and let the world know he was unmoved. To his defenders, he was stoic. To his critics, he was unaccountable. And in the new digital age, where every word, every pause, every glance became a meme. His aloofness took on new meaning. Social media painted him as the face of elite detachment, the man who listened least while holding the most power. Threads dissected his rulings, late-night hosts mocked his absences, and hashtags called for transparency. Yet none of it reached him. In his world, scrutiny was beneath him. But what Thomas didn't see was that the country around him had changed. The old reverence for power had begun to crack. A new generation had risen, louder, sharper, less forgiving. They wanted answers, not excuses. Accountability, not distance. And leading that charge were voices like Jasmine Crockett's, bold, articulate, and unafraid to challenge the sanctity of the robe. In that committee room, the atmosphere bent toward hierarchy. The dark-paneled walls seemed to absorb dissent, the portraits of past justices gazing down like guardians of the old order. Thomas thrived in such spaces. He had been trained to. He knew how to command silence with a glance, how to make a pause feel like a verdict. And when he looked across the table at Crockett, he saw what he thought was another challenger easily dismissed. He didn't see the years of courtroom battles that had sharpened her resolve. He didn't recognize the steel in her restraint. He saw only youth, audacity, and a threat to the hierarchy he'd mastered. To him, this wasn't a debate. It was a reminder of rank. And so, as she pressed him on judicial ethics, he leaned back, shoulders squared, voice calm, but dripping with the superiority of a man convinced he could outlast any storm. In his mind, she was another voice in a sea of critics, a temporary inconvenience. But to millions watching, that composure had begun to crack under the weight of its own arrogance. The optics were shifting. What once looked like confidence now read as contempt. The faintest tightening of his jaw, the subtle roll of his eyes, the adjusting of his glasses, each gesture broadcasted across screens, dissected in real time. The internet didn't see wisdom, it saw entitlement. He had faced senators, presidents, and decades of protest, but never someone quite like her. And that difference was about to cost him his composure. Before the cameras, before the headlines, before the name, Jasmine Crockett became a symbol of fearless defiance. There was a woman fighting for people no one else would stand beside. In the dim light of Texas courthouses, she cut her teeth on the cases other lawyers avoided. Wrongful evictions, racial profiling, families torn apart by a system that had already decided their worth. She didn't enter law for prestige. She entered because she had seen what happens when justice hides behind paperwork. The days were long, the pay was short, and the victories, when they came, were quiet. But every small win built something inside her, a spine of fire, an unshakable belief that truth meant nothing unless it was defended out loud. Her courtroom wasn't marble and mahogany. It was concrete floors, flickering fluorescence, a jury that barely looked up. Yet in those rooms, Crockett learned the most dangerous skill in politics: how to stay composed while dismantling injustice, one question at a time. When she finally ran for office, it wasn't a climb, it was to amplify. Her campaign speeches weren't polished monologues. They were lived experiences dressed as policy. Every word carried the cadence of someone who had been underestimated so often. It had become her secret weapon. She spoke for the single mother, the immigrant laborer, the young black student told to tone it down. She didn't represent them from a distance. She was them, with a law degree in one hand and defiance in the other. In interviews, she smiled easily but sparingly. She talked about struggle the way some talk about family, intimately, unashamedly. "I learned to stand tall," she once said, "because the world kept trying to make me bow." In that truth lay her paradox. She was both grace and grit. She didn't perform outrage. She embodied resilience. While others practiced power, she practiced persistence. She carried her law degree like armor, not privilege. Every insult, every interruption, every dismissive glance from men who thought they owned the definition of qualified only polished that armor brighter. And so, when she sat across from Justice Clarence Thomas that day, it wasn't intimidation she felt. It was déjà vu. She had met his kind before, not in robes, but in courtrooms where arrogance tried to masquerade as intellect. She had learned to recognize the smirk that meant, "You don't belong here." And she had built an entire career proving that she did. The world saw a young Congresswoman facing down a Supreme Court justice. But Crockett didn't see a hierarchy, she saw a challenge. One more test of whether truth could still stand its ground against condescension wrapped in ceremony. Her calm wasn't passive. It was powered by every case she had argued, every door that had been closed in her face, every time she'd been talked over and decided to respond with evidence instead of ego. That day, her voice would not just defend her intellect. It would defend every woman who'd ever been told to sit quietly while the powerful pontificated. She had come too far, fought too hard, and built too much to flinch now. And as the silence thickened, as the eyes of the chamber bore into her, she felt the weight of that armor settle across her shoulders. And today, that armor was about to meet its greatest test. The air in the chamber had turned dense, charged with the kind of tension that makes even seasoned aides hold their breath. Justice Thomas leaned in, his tone polished but pointed. "Congresswoman, your interpretation of precedent seems selective. Are you certain you've read the ruling in full?" The words carried a subtle sneer, one that cloaked insult as inquiry. Crockett nodded once, her gaze steady. "Yes, Justice, I'm quite certain." He cut her off before she could continue. "Because it would appear to anyone familiar with constitutional jurisprudence that your argument lacks foundation." The sentence landed like a hammer. A few heads turned, as if watching a spectacle rather than a hearing. Somewhere in the back, a microphone hissed faintly, the only sound that dared to interrupt him. Crockett stayed still, every second of her silence drawing the room tighter around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but unwavering. "With respect, my interpretation is grounded in fact, not tradition." He laughed under his breath, that same laugh that had ended countless challenges before. Tradition. Congresswoman is the foundation. The murmur that followed wasn't agreement. It was discomfort. A camera panned slowly across the table, capturing the faces of those who suddenly realized how condescending the exchange had become. One aide lowered his eyes. Another justice shifted in his seat. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Thomas, expression calm, as if studying a man revealing more about himself than about the law. The faintest smile touched her lips, not arrogance, but recognition. Her composure was beginning to unsettle him. His interruptions grew shorter, his tone sharper. "You're avoiding the central issue," he snapped. "I'm defining it," she replied, her voice like steady current. That line drew a hush, so complete it felt like the building itself had paused. For the first time, Thomas blinked, thrown off his rhythm. The balance had shifted, though no one could yet explain how. Every eye in the room was on her now. The cameras zoomed closer. Then she leaned forward, and the tone of the entire room changed. She didn't rush. The silence stretched, taut, and humming. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm, deliberate, every syllable landing like a measured strike. "Justice Thomas," she began, "since you've invited a discussion on precedent, let's have one." Her tone was not defiant. It was surgical. She opened a folder, eyes never leaving his. "You referenced the Shelby County versus Holder decision as proof of the court's consistency. But in South Carolina versus Katzenbach, this very court, your court, upheld the Voting Rights Act as constitutional. You called that ruling an outdated approach. Yet the only thing outdated," she paused, letting the weight of the moment hang, "was the empathy it represented." A ripple passed through the chamber. Pens froze. Even the stenographer looked up. She continued, voice unwavering. "In Dobbs versus Jackson, you argued the Constitution must be read through the lens of history. But whose history, Justice? The same one that wrote people like me out of the definition of citizenship." Thomas shifted just slightly, his hand brushing the edge of his papers. "You call it interpretation," Crockett went on, "but to millions watching, it looks like preservation. Preservation of a system where accountability never flows upward." Aide whispers cut across the silence. Cameras zoomed in. The faint whir of a lens adjustment echoed like thunder in the quiet. Crockett didn't raise her volume. She didn't need to. Her words filled the room like truth reclaiming its space. You said tradition is the foundation, she continued. But tradition has been used to justify everything from segregation to silence. Law is not sacred because it's old, Justice. It's sacred because it's fair. For a moment, even Thomas didn't speak. The pause stretched, a still frame in a film that had just shifted genres. He adjusted his glasses, a gesture meant to reassert control, but it came too late. Crockett's momentum was unstoppable. You once wrote, she said, glancing briefly at her notes, the court must avoid the appearance of bias. Yet you've accepted gifts, trips, and undisclosed favors from those with business before this court. Her voice didn't tremble. It resonated. So if we're here to discuss understanding of ethics and law, I think the American people deserve to know which definition we're using. Gasps rippled through the chamber. One mouthed wow. Another covered his lips, eyes wide. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound followed. The silence pressed heavier now, not respectful, stunned. Crockett leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. You see, Justice, my legal training wasn't built on privilege. It was built on reality. I learned that justice means nothing if it only moves in one direction. Every line hit like a gavel. She wasn't attacking. She was unveiling. Each point, each citation, peeled back the armor of authority until all that remained was contradiction. This isn't about you or me, she added, voice softening but never losing edge. It's about every citizen who wonders whether truth can still stand taller than title. I ask hard questions because I still believe in the law, and I won't apologize for expecting those entrusted with it to live by it. By now, the entire room was motionless. The glow of screens reflected in astonished faces. A journalist in the back lowered his pen, forgetting to take notes. Crockett's eyes never wavered. She spoke her final line like it had been waiting its whole life to be said. With all due respect, Justice Thomas, legal skill isn't measured by who's sitting highest, but by who stands firmest. The words struck the air like a bell. For a second, no one breathed. Then, as if a signal had been given, a wave of murmurs surged through the chamber. Some in awe, some in disbelief, all charged with the realization that they had just witnessed something irreversible. The chamber erupted, but that was only the beginning. The moment hit the internet like a lightning strike. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's exchange flooded every social feed, spliced and subtitled in bold letters. Legal skill isn't measured by who's sitting highest, but by who stands firmest. Hashtag Crockett Shutdown rocketed to the top of trending lists before the hearing had even adjourned. On X, one user wrote, "That wasn't a clap back. That was a legal sermon." Another posted a split-screen meme of Thomas looking stunned beside Crockett's calm, unflinching expression, when confidence has receipts. News anchors replayed the footage in slow motion, narrating the shift in tone as though chronicling a political earthquake. Late-night hosts called it the line of the decade. Even conservative pundits, usually eager to downplay her, struggled to frame a counterpunch. One murmured, "Well, she came prepared." Reaction videos flooded YouTube, professors breaking down her citations, young women calling her a masterclass in calm power, and one viral TikTok simply captioned, "When brilliance doesn't ask for validation." But it wasn't just about a debate. Something deeper had cracked open. Commentators began connecting the dots, that this was more than one woman standing up to a Supreme Court justice. It was the new generation confronting the old guard of untouchable authority. She didn't just argue, said one CNN analyst. She redefined the optics of respect. She showed that intellect, when wielded with restraint, can silence arrogance more effectively than outrage ever could. The symbolism grew larger than the moment itself. Her composure became an emblem of women who'd been talked over in meetings, of first-generation professionals who'd had to prove they belonged twice over, of every voice that had been told its perspective was uninformed. Crockett hadn't shouted, hadn't gestured wildly, hadn't sought applause. And yet, the resonance of her words spread faster than any slogan could. Memes turned into think pieces. Think pieces turned into op-eds. The conversation shifted from what she said to what it meant. One headline captured it best: "The day dignity out-argued power." In classrooms, debate clubs, and online forums, her line was being quoted like a modern maxim: dissected, celebrated, repeated. Law students began calling it the Crockett Standard. The country wasn't just entertained. It was moved, reminded that expertise doesn't come from elevation, but from earned understanding. Narrator tone deepens, reflective. In one exchange, she reminded America that brilliance needs no permission, and truth, when spoken without fear, can pierce through the highest walls of power. And yet, even as the applause grew louder, the deeper message had just begun to unfold. In the days that followed, the noise of the moment gave way to something quieter: reflection. Commentators dissected every frame, every pause, every glance. But beyond the headlines and hashtags, what lingered wasn't just a viral takedown. It was a lesson written in composure. Jasmine Crockett hadn't sought to embarrass Justice Thomas. She had sought to remind the nation, and perhaps him, that respect isn't granted by status. It's earned through substance, through the willingness to stand in truth, even when the weight of hierarchy presses down. Her response had carried more than intellect. It carried restraint, the rare kind of strength that doesn't roar, but resonates. Every attempt to belittle truth, she told a journalist days later, only exposes fear of it. That line became more than a quote. It became a mirror. Across the country, classrooms replayed her exchange not as a clash, but as a case study in dignity. Professors paused their lectures to talk about tone, courage, and what it means to defend principle in a room built to test it. In small law schools and community centers, her words played on projectors. Young women watching, nodding, whispering to themselves, "That's how you do it." What began as a courtroom confrontation became a cultural reflection on who gets to define expertise, who is allowed to speak, and how calm clarity can sometimes carry more revolution than rage. Crockett had shown that wisdom doesn't bow to arrogance. It reveals it. And in that revelation, something shifted. For every student who had been dismissed for speaking too passionately, for every professional whose insight was met with condescension, her poise stood as proof. You don't have to match arrogance to defeat it. You just have to outlast it. She had turned insult into instruction, mockery into meaning. And in doing so, she had rewritten the unwritten rule that those seated highest always speak with the most authority. Because power can intimidate, but wisdom enlightens. It endures beyond the echo of argument, beyond applause or outrage. It lingers quietly, profoundly, reminding us that true influence doesn't come from volume, but from vision. And so, as the lights dimmed on the week's headlines and the nation moved on to its next debate, the image remained. Jasmine Crockett, calm amid the storm, teaching through composure what no verdict could ever define. Sometimes, one woman's composure can shake an entire institution. He mocked her legal skill, but it was that very skill that exposed his weakness. In a room built on hierarchy, Jasmine Crockett reminded America that truth still outranks ego, and courage still outweighs privilege. Her calm didn't just silence arrogance, it redefined power itself. If you believe composure is power, share this moment. Let it remind every voice ever dismissed that brilliance doesn't need permission to speak. Subscribe and be part of the movement that refuses to bow when arrogance tries to silence brilliance.